Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that might lull you into the deepest sleep of your life. The utterly terrifying reality of being trapped in a tin can hurtling through the vacuum of space, while everything that does go wrong in spectacular fashion. We're diving into what life was really like aboard Apollo 13 during those 4 harrowing days in April 1970, when 3 astronauts went from moon-bound heroes to survivors, playing the ultimate game of cosmic Russian roulette with death itself. Forget the Hollywood version with Tom Hanks delivering perfectly timed one-liners while solving problems with the calm efficiency of a suburban dad fixing a leaky faucet on a Saturday afternoon. The truth is, if you were dropped into that command module on April 13th, 1970, you probably wouldn't last 12 hours, let alone 4 days of pure survival hell. You'd be dead faster than it takes for Houston to realize they have a problem, and believe me, that's saying something when NASA's communication delays make customer service hold times look like lightning-fast responses from people who actually want to help you. So before you get comfortable in your modern bed, with its miracle of climate control and breathable atmosphere that doesn't require constant monitoring by teams of engineers, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world as we explore the lives of people who were literally separated from the world by 200,000 miles of absolutely nothing but cold, dark, airless space that wants to kill you in ways you haven't even imagined yet. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum that definitely won't sound like the life support systems failing catastrophically, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. A journey through the cold vacuum of space, impossible engineering challenges that would make rocket scientists weep, and the kind of survival that makes every reality show look like a pleasant weekend getaway hosted by people who actually want you to make it home alive instead of becoming space debris. You wake up on April 11th, 1970, except you don't really wake up because you haven't slept properly in weeks. Your body is running on a combination of adrenaline, training, and the kind of nervous energy that comes from knowing you're about to strap yourself to what is essentially the world's most expensive and complicated firework. You're about to become one of only 24 human beings who have ever traveled to the moon. That sounds impressive until you realize that more people have won the lottery than have survived a trip to lunar orbit. The odds are not exactly in your favor when you're dealing with technology that didn't exist 10 years ago and physics that most people don't understand even when their lives don't depend on it. You're strapped into a metal contraption that weighs about as much as a small office building but somehow needs to break free from Earth's gravitational pull using controlled explosions that could level several city blocks if they go wrong. Your name is either Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, or Fred Hayes. Doesn't matter which one, because all three of you are about to have the worst 4 days of your lives. And considering these guys flew test aircraft for a living, that's really saying something about what's coming your way. The morning starts at Kennedy Space Center in Florida, where the humidity makes everything feel like you're breathing through a wet towel, and the alligators in the nearby swamps serve as a constant reminder that even Earth is trying to kill you before you get to space. You're wearing a white pressure suit that weighs about 30 pounds and makes you look like the Michelin Man's astronaut cousin who got into shape but kept the puffy appearance. The suit is designed to keep you alive in an environment that actively wants to kill you in creative ways. The designers basically said, here's some fabric and metal between you and the infinite darkness of space that contains temperatures cold enough to freeze your blood instantly. Good luck with that arrangement. You're walking to the launch pad knowing that you're about to climb on top of what is essentially the world's most expensive and complicated suicide machine. The Saturn V rocket beneath you contains enough fuel to level several city blocks and enough explosive power to accidentally create a new crater in Florida if someone sneezes at the wrong control panel. It's basically a controlled demolition that happens to be pointed away from Earth, assuming everything goes according to plan. And if there's one thing you should know about space exploration in 1970, It's that absolutely nothing ever goes according to plan for more than 5 minutes at a time. Ready for this adventure? Jim Lovell asks as you waddle toward the elevator that will take you up to the command module like the world's most nervous penguins heading towards certain doom. Jim's the mission commander, which means he's the guy who gets blamed if everyone dies and praised if everyone survives. He's done this 3 times before, including being one of the first humans to orbit the moon on Apollo 8. He should be used to it by now, but there's something in his voice that suggests even experienced astronauts never quite get comfortable with strapping themselves to barely controlled explosions that could vaporize them faster than you can say, "Houston, we have a problem." As ready as anyone can be for riding a bomb to the moon, Jack Swigert replies with the kind of dark humor that astronauts develop when their job description includes, "may be incinerated without warning." Jack's the command module pilot, which is a fancy way of saying he's the guy who operates the spacecraft that's supposed to bring everyone home alive. He wasn't supposed to be here today. Ken Mattingly was supposed to be sitting in that seat, but got benched because he might have been exposed to measles 3 weeks ago. Yes. Measles, the same childhood disease that your elementary school classmates gave you, kept a trained astronaut off a moon mission. Space exploration in 1970, folks. 1 part cutting-edge technology, 1 part hoping nobody gets sick at the wrong time, and 1 part praying that Murphy's Law takes a vacation. Fred Hayes is the 3rd member of this cheerful crew. He's the lunar module pilot, which means he's supposed to land on the moon with Jim, while Jack orbits overhead like the world's loneliest taxi driver. Fred's been dreaming of walking on the moon since he was a kid growing up in Mississippi. Unfortunately, the universe has other plans for Fred that involve survival instead of lunar exploration. But he doesn't know that yet, as he climbs into the command module with the enthusiasm of someone who thinks the next 4 days are going to be the highlight of his career instead of a masterclass in creative problem-solving. Under impossible pressure, you settle into your seat inside the command module, which looks like the cockpit of a commercial airliner, if that airliner was designed by engineers who were simultaneously trying to fit the controls of an entire power plant into something the size of a large closet while making sure everything was labeled in a way that would confuse anyone trying to operate it during an emergency. There are switches everywhere, hundreds of them. Each one controls something vital to keeping you alive, or something vital to completing the mission, or something vital to not accidentally firing rockets when you don't want to fire rockets. Toggle the wrong switch and you might turn off life support. Toggle another wrong switch and you might accidentally fire the service module engine when you're not supposed to and send yourself spinning off toward Mars. Toggle yet another wrong switch and you might discover new and creative ways to die in space that NASA hasn't even thought of yet. The instrument panel looks like it was designed by someone who really enjoyed making things complicated. There are gauges for monitoring oxygen pressure, electrical systems, fuel levels, navigation computers, communication systems, life support functions, and about 50 other things that could kill you if they stop working properly. Each gauge has multiple settings and multiple warning levels and multiple ways to indicate that something is wrong without necessarily telling you what's wrong or how to fix it. It's like trying to monitor the health of a small city using instruments that were designed by people who assumed you'd have plenty of time to figure out what everything means. The countdown begins with all the drama and tension of a medieval execution. 10, 9, 8, 7. You're thinking about everything that could go wrong, which is basically everything because space travel in 1970 is still more art than science. The Saturn V rocket beneath you contains enough fuel to level several city blocks and enough complexity to confuse teams of rocket scientists who designed it. It's basically a controlled demolition that happens to be pointed away from Earth, assuming the pointing mechanism works correctly and the explosion happens at the right time and in the right direction. 6, 5, 4, the engines ignite with a roar that can be heard from miles away. If you were standing outside, you'd feel the ground shake like an earthquake was announcing the end of the world. Inside the command module, you feel like you're sitting on top of a controlled volcano that someone convinced to explode in a specific direction. 3, 2, 1. And suddenly you're experiencing what it feels like to have several million pounds of thrust applied directly to your spine, while hoping that all the engineering calculations were correct and that physics works the same way in practice as it does in textbooks. The acceleration is absolutely brutal. Your body suddenly weighs about 4 times what it normally does. Your organs are being pressed against your ribcage like someone put you in a centrifuge designed by someone who really doesn't like you and wants to make sure you understand that. The rocket is shaking so violently that you can't read the instruments even if you wanted to, which you desperately do because those instruments are telling you whether you're about to explode or merely about to have the worst headache of your life, followed by the worst 4 days of your life. Your vision tunnels as the G-forces make your cardiovascular system work overtime just to keep blood flowing to your brain. It's like being inside a washing machine during an earthquake while someone shoots you out of a cannon. The noise is incredible, not just loud, but physically overwhelming. You can feel the vibrations in your bones. Your teeth are chattering not from fear, although there's plenty of that, but from the mechanical vibrations of barely controlled explosions happening directly beneath you. "Everything looking good down here," comes the voice from Mission Control in Houston, transmitted through radio waves that somehow managed to find your spacecraft despite all the electrical interference from the rocket engines. Easy for them to say. They're sitting in comfortable chairs, drinking coffee and eating donuts while you're experiencing what it might feel like to be inside a washing machine during an earthquake that's also on fire. The first stage burns for about 2.5 minutes. That's 150 seconds of your life, spent wondering if this will be the last 150 seconds of your life, and whether you'll have time to regret your career choices before you become a brief firework display over the Atlantic Ocean. Then the first stage separates with a bang that you feel more than here. Suddenly you go from being pressed into your seat to feeling like you're falling off a cliff. Zero gravity hits you like a surprise slap from physics that forgot to warn you it was coming. Your stomach doesn't know which way is up because there is no up anymore. There's just you and 2 other guys in a metal can floating through space, hoping that Newton's laws work the way they're supposed to and that rocket science is more science than educated guessing mixed with hope and prayer. First stage separation confirmed. Jim reports to Houston with the kind of professional calm that astronauts develop when their job involves experiencing things that would make normal people pass out from terror. His voice is steady, but you can hear the relief underneath. 1 major explosion down, only several more to go before you reach orbit. The second stage ignites with another round of acceleration that makes you remember why you took this job in the first place. Hint: it wasn't for the comfortable working conditions. The second stage acceleration is different from the first. Less violent, but more sustained. Like being pressed into your seat by a giant invisible hand that doesn't plan to let go anytime soon. The vibrations are different too, more of a steady rumble than the bone-shaking violence of the first stage. You can actually read some of the instruments now, which is good, because those instruments are telling you important things like whether you're still on course to reach orbit instead of the bottom of the ocean. By the time you reach orbit, you've been shaken, compressed, accelerated, and launched at speeds that would make Formula One drivers weep with envy and probably quit their jobs to become accountants. You're traveling at about 17,500 miles per hour, which is fast enough to circle the entire Earth in 90 minutes. It's also fast enough that if something goes wrong, you'll have very little time to fix it before you either burn up in the atmosphere like a meteor with delusions of grandeur, or drift off into space to become the solar system's loneliest popsicle. The view from orbit is spectacular in a way that makes you understand why people become astronauts despite the obvious risks of death by explosion, suffocation, freezing, burning up, or any combination of the above. Earth hangs below you like a blue and white marble suspended in infinite darkness. You can see weather systems that cover entire continents. You can see the Terminator line that separates day from night moving across the planet's surface. You can see city lights on the night side that represent millions of people who have no idea that 3 guys are flying overhead in a metal can powered by controlled explosions and hope. But you're not here for sightseeing. You're here to go to the moon, which requires more acceleration, more explosions, and more opportunities for things to go catastrophically wrong. The translunar injection burn happens about 2.5 hours after launch. This is when the third stage engine fires for about 6 minutes to throw you toward the moon at speeds that make your current orbital velocity look leisurely. It's like being shot out of a cannon by someone who calculated the trajectory using math that most people don't understand, even when their lives don't depend on it. The first 2 days of the mission go smoothly, too smoothly. You should be suspicious of anything that goes this well when you're dealing with technology that didn't exist 10 years ago and physics that killed people when they got the calculations wrong. You're eating food that comes in tubes and bags because normal food doesn't work in zero gravity. The menu includes delicacies like beef stew that taste like cardboard mixed with sadness, turkey and gravy that resembles neither turkey nor gravy, and something called chocolate pudding that tastes like chocolate in the same way that cardboard tastes like fine dining. "This stuff isn't getting any better," Fred Hayes comments, squeezing what is allegedly beef stew into his mouth like toothpaste made of disappointment. Fred's the lunar module pilot who was supposed to walk on the moon alongside Jim Lovell. Instead, he's going to spend the next few days learning creative ways to not die in space while eating food that makes military rations look like gourmet cuisine. The irony is not lost on anyone. "Could be worse," Jack replies with the optimism of someone who hasn't tried the tuna salad yet. "Could be the shrimp cocktail." Space food in 1970 is what happens when nutritionists collaborate with people who have never eaten anything enjoyable in their lives and don't plan to start now. Everything is dehydrated, freeze-dried, compressed, or processed into forms that barely resemble food and taste even worse than they look. The beef stew is brown paste that claims to be beef stew. The turkey and gravy is beige paste that hopes to be turkey and gravy. The chocolate pudding is darker, paste that dreams of being chocolate pudding but settles for being edible enough to keep you alive. Water comes from fuel cells that produce electricity as a byproduct of combining hydrogen and oxygen. Even your drinking water is a byproduct of the system keeping you alive, which sounds poetic until you realize that you're basically drinking rocket exhaust that happens to be clean enough not to kill you immediately. It tastes exactly like what you'd expect rocket exhaust to taste like if rocket exhaust were filtered enough to be technically safe for human consumption. The sleeping arrangements are about as comfortable as you'd expect in something designed by engineers who prioritized not dying over getting a good night's rest or basic human comfort. You sleep in sleeping bags attached to the walls because there's no up or down in zero gravity, so you can sleep in any orientation you want. Unfortunately, all orientations in a space capsule are equally uncomfortable. It's like trying to sleep inside a refrigerator that someone filled with switches and blinking lights and the constant hum of machinery that keeps you alive but never stops making noise. Sleep in zero gravity is weird in ways that nobody warns you about. Your arms float in front of you like you're sleepwalking through a dream. Your hair stands up in all directions like you stuck your finger in an electrical socket. Your spine stretches out because gravity isn't compressing it anymore, which sounds relaxing until you realize that all your internal organs are also floating around in new and uncomfortable positions. The spacecraft makes noises constantly. Fans humming, pumps cycling, computers beeping, and the occasional random bang or click that makes you wonder if something important just broke or if the spacecraft is just settling into its new environment like a house at night. Except houses don't explode if they settle wrong. Every noise could be normal operation or imminent catastrophe, and there's no way to tell the difference without checking dozens of instruments and hoping you interpret them correctly. On the evening of April 13th, you're about 2 days into the mission and 55 hours and 54 minutes after launch, to be precise about timing that's about to become very important. You've completed the translunar injection burn successfully. That's NASA speak for, "We've fired the engines to throw you toward the moon and hope you get there instead of overshooting and becoming permanent residents of deep space." You're traveling through the vacuum of space at about 25,000 miles per hour. Earth is getting smaller behind you. The moon is getting larger ahead of you. Everything is going according to plan. That should have been your first warning. Nothing involving rocket ships and the vacuum of space ever goes according to plan for very long. Murphy's Law applies with special enthusiasm to space exploration. If something can go wrong, it will go wrong at the worst possible moment in the worst possible way. And if something can't go wrong, it will find a way to go wrong anyway, just to prove that Murphy was an optimist. The service module behind you contains most of the spacecraft's consumables: oxygen tanks, hydrogen tanks, fuel cells that generate electricity, water for drinking and cooling, and basically everything you need to stay alive during the trip to the moon and back. It's like the supply trailer for a camping trip, except the camping trip is happening in an environment that will kill you instantly if the supply trailer stops working properly. No pressure at all. "Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here," Jack Swigert says into the radio at 9:55 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on April 13th. Those 8 words are about to become some of the most famous in the history of space exploration. They're also about to describe the beginning of the worst 4 days these 3 men will ever experience. And considering they're test pilots who risked their lives for a living, that's saying something about what's coming. What Jack is reporting so calmly is that there has been an explosion in the service module. Not a little explosion like a firecracker. Not a small malfunction like a fuse blowing. An explosion. In space. 200,000 miles from Earth. In the part of your spacecraft that contains most of your oxygen, most of your electrical power, most of your water, and most of your chances of getting home alive. The explosion is powerful enough to rock the entire spacecraft and send debris flying into space like the world's most expensive firework display. The explosion happened in oxygen tank number 2, which sounds technical and manageable until you understand what oxygen tanks in spacecraft actually are. These are not like the little tanks you might use for medical purposes or scuba diving. These are high-pressure vessels containing oxygen at about 900 pounds per square inch, which is roughly 60 times atmospheric pressure. When they explode, they really explode with enough force to damage nearby systems and send shockwaves through the entire spacecraft structure. "Roger, we've got you," replies Jack Lausmer from Mission Control, with the kind of professional calm that flight controllers develop when their job involves talking to people who might be about to die in space. Jack's one of the CAPCOMs, which stands for Capsule Communicator, though by 1970 they're communicating with command modules instead of capsules. That's the guy whose job is to talk to the astronauts and try to sound calm, even when everything is falling apart faster than a poorly constructed house of cards in a hurricane mixed with an earthquake. "Can you give us more details about this problem you're experiencing?" "More details? Sure. How about this detail? You're now flying through space in a crippled spacecraft with rapidly diminishing power, limited water, questionable oxygen supplies, and unlimited ways to die before you make it home. The command module, which is supposed to be your home for the next few days, is now running on battery power that was designed to last a few hours during re-entry, not several days during a crisis that nobody planned for because nobody imagined this particular combination of failures could happen all at once. We're venting something out into space, Jim Lovell reports as he looks out the window at something that should not be there. What he's seeing is not encouraging for anyone who prefers their spacecraft to remain intact. There's debris floating around the spacecraft like confetti at the world's worst party. There are also clouds of gas venting from the service module, creating crystalline formations that sparkle in the sunlight like deadly snow globes made of things that are supposed to stay inside the spacecraft. In space, gas doesn't behave like it does on Earth, where it just drifts away and disperses. In the vacuum of space, gas forms clouds and crystals that follow orbital mechanics and stick around much longer than you want them to. The venting gas creates a visible trail behind the spacecraft, like a comet tail made of your life support supplies. It's beautiful in a terrifying way that makes you appreciate how the universe can be simultaneously magnificent and deadly. The situation is becoming clear to everyone in Mission Control, except the people who need to fix it don't have all the information yet. The explosion has damaged the spacecraft's ability to generate power using fuel cells. The fuel cells that produce electricity need oxygen to work. And with oxygen tank number 2 destroyed and oxygen tank number 1 damaged, the fuel cells are shutting down one by one, like dominoes falling in slow motion. It's like having the power go out in your house, except your house is traveling through the vacuum of space, and the nearest hardware store is 200,000 miles away and closed indefinitely. We need to power down the command module, Gene Kranz tells his flight controllers in Mission Control Room 3. Gene's the flight director, which means his job is to make decisions that keep astronauts alive when those decisions seem impossible to make. Right now, he's looking at a situation that seems specifically designed to make that job impossible. The flight controllers around him are frantically checking procedures and calling up data on computer screens that display information in green text on black backgrounds because color monitors haven't been invented yet. We need to conserve power for re-entry because that's assuming we can figure out how to get them home alive in the first place. Powering down the command module means shutting off most of the systems that keep you comfortable and informed about what's happening. No more environmental control systems to regulate temperature and humidity. No more cabin heating to keep you warm in the cold vacuum of space. No more of the little luxuries that make space travel merely unpleasant instead of completely unbearable. The temperature inside the command module is going to drop to about 38 degrees Fahrenheit, which is cold enough to see your breath, and cold enough to make you very aware that you're sitting inside a metal can floating through an environment that is roughly 400 degrees below zero. The command module's electrical systems are shutting down in sequence like lights going out in an office building at the end of the day, except the office building is your life support system, and the day might be your last day if you can't figure out alternative arrangements. First, the non-essential systems go dark, then the partially essential systems. Then you're left with only the most critical systems running on battery power that needs to last until re-entry, assuming you can figure out how to get to re-entry in the first place. We're going to have to use the lunar module as a lifeboat, Gene decides after conferring with his team of engineers who are frantically calculating power consumption rates and life support requirements. This is not what the lunar module was designed for. The lunar module was designed to land 2 astronauts on the moon for a couple of days and then bring them back to the command module for the trip home. It was not designed to keep 3 astronauts alive for 4 days while flying around the moon and back to Earth. It's like trying to use a motorcycle to tow a trailer that's bigger than the motorcycle, and also the trailer contains everything you need to stay alive. The lunar module is significantly smaller than the command module. Much smaller. It's basically a metal tent with rocket engines attached to it, and life support systems that were designed for short-term use by 2 people, not long-term survival by 3 people. It has enough oxygen for 2 people for about 2 days. It has enough water for 2 people for about 2 days. It has enough electrical power for 2 people for about 2 days. You need life support for 3 people for 4 days. The math is not encouraging and doesn't get better the more you think about it. Aquarius, this is Houston. Jack Lausma calls to the lunar module using its call sign. Aquarius, that's your new home now. It's a name that sounds peaceful and watery when you're on Earth thinking about astronomy. When you're in space trying not to die, it sounds like the most important word you'll ever hear and possibly the last home you'll ever have if things don't go well over the next few days. Moving from the command module to the lunar module is not like walking from one room to another in your house. It's more like crawling through a tunnel that connects 2 different worlds with completely different life support systems, electrical systems, and ways of keeping you alive. The command module is spacious compared to the lunar module. The lunar module is cramped compared to basically anything larger than a large closet. 3 grown men in spacesuits trying to live in the lunar module is like 3 grown men trying to live in a small bathroom for 4 days while solving engineering problems that could kill them if they get the math wrong. The lunar module wasn't designed for long-term habitation by anyone, let alone 3 people who are supposed to be visiting tourists rather than permanent residents. It doesn't have a proper toilet, just a waste management system that makes using a porta potty seem luxurious. It doesn't have sleeping quarters, just open space where you can attach sleeping bags to walls and hope you don't drift into critical equipment while you sleep. It doesn't have most of the amenities that make being trapped in space merely miserable instead of completely unbearable. What the lunar module does have is life support systems that might keep you alive long enough to figure out how to get home, assuming you can stretch those systems far beyond their design limits without breaking them completely. The environmental control system was designed to process carbon dioxide exhaled by 2 people, not 3. The water cooling system was designed to cool electronics operated by 2 people, not 3. The electrical system was designed to power equipment used by 2 people, not 3. Everything is being pushed beyond its design specifications from the moment you move in. We need to figure out a trajectory that gets us around the moon and back to Earth. Gene Kranz tells his trajectory specialists in mission control, who are now facing a problem that combines orbital mechanics with crisis management. This sounds simple until you remember that you're dealing with orbital mechanics, which is what happens when physics gets complicated enough to make rocket scientists cry, and normal people's brains shut down in self-defense. You can't just turn around in space like you're making a U-turn on a highway. Space doesn't work that way. In space, everything is moving, and everything affects everything else, through gravitational forces that operate according to laws that Newton figured out, but most people can't calculate without computers. You need to use gravitational forces and engine burns timed precisely enough to make Swiss clockmakers jealous and executed perfectly enough to make brain surgeons nervous. One mistake in timing or duration or direction, and you miss Earth entirely and become permanent residents of deep space with a very limited supply of everything you need to stay alive. The plan becomes this. Use the moon's gravity to slingshot around the lunar surface and back toward Earth, like a cosmic billiard ball that happens to contain 3 human beings who would prefer not to become space debris. It's called a free return trajectory, though the word free here doesn't mean it costs nothing. It means you're letting gravity do most of the work instead of using engine burns that consume fuel. You don't have to spare and might not work properly because your spacecraft is crippled and nothing is working the way it's supposed to work. It's an elegant solution to a problem that is anything but elegant. The moon's gravity will grab your spacecraft as you approach and whip you around the lunar surface like a stone thrown from a slingshot. Except the stone contains 3 people who need to arrive at Earth at exactly the right angle and exactly the right speed to survive re-entry, instead of burning up like a meteor or skipping off the atmosphere like a stone skipping on water. But first, you need to make sure you can complete the trajectory without running out of consumables or having critical systems fail before you get home. The lunar module's descent engine needs to fire at exactly the right time for exactly the right duration to put toward Earth that will actually intersect with Earth instead of missing it by thousands of miles. If you fire the engine too long, you'll overshoot Earth and drift off into space to become the solar system's most expensive piece of space debris. If you don't fire it long enough, you'll hit Earth's atmosphere at the wrong angle and burn up like a meteor with delusions of grandeur and 3 very disappointed passengers. Descent engine burn in 5 minutes, Jim Lovell announces as he prepares to use the lunar module's descent engine for something it was never designed to do. He's now the commander of a lunar module that was never supposed to be commanded by anyone for more than a few hours at a time during lunar landing operations. The descent engine is designed to land softly on the moon, not to perform course corrections for a crippled spacecraft carrying 3 people who need to get home alive. Using it this way is like using a Formula One race car to pull a trailer, assuming the race car was designed by people who never imagined it would need to pull trailers, and the trailer contains everything you need to stay alive. The engine burn lasts 34 seconds that feel like 34 minutes. 34 seconds during which you're hoping that rocket engines behave the way they're supposed to behave according to the laws of physics, and that Newton's laws of motion work the same way in space as they do in physics textbooks, written by people who never had to test those laws while their lives depended on getting the answers right. The engine fires smoothly, which is a relief, because smooth engine burns are not guaranteed when you're operating equipment beyond its design specifications. The burn puts you on a trajectory that should bring you back to Earth in about 4 days, assuming nothing else breaks, and assuming your calculations are correct, and assuming the universe doesn't decide to demonstrate Murphy's Law with additional enthusiasm. Should being another one of those words that sounds more reassuring than it actually is when you're discussing survival in space while flying in a spacecraft that's already proven that things can go wrong in ways nobody anticipated. Now comes the really fun part that will test your survival skills in ways that astronaut training never quite prepared you for. You need to survive for 4 days in a spacecraft that was designed to keep people alive for 2 days. The life support systems in the lunar module are already working overtime, like employees who were promised a normal workload but are now handling triple shifts without additional resources. The carbon dioxide scrubbers are processing exhaust from 3 people instead of 2. The oxygen supply is being consumed by 3 people instead of 2. The power systems are supporting 3 people instead of 2. Everything is being pushed beyond its design limits, and you're still 3.5 days away from home. Carbon dioxide becomes your most immediate enemy in a way that makes you appreciate how Earth's atmosphere works without you having to think about it. Every time you exhale, you're adding carbon dioxide to the cabin atmosphere. In a normal house, this isn't a problem because there's enough air circulation and plants and atmospheric exchange to handle the carbon dioxide you produce. In a spacecraft, the carbon dioxide you exhale needs to be chemically removed from the air, or it will accumulate to levels that will kill you slowly and unpleasantly. The lunar module has lithium hydroxide canisters that remove carbon dioxide from the air through chemical absorption. But the canisters are designed for 2 people for 2 days, not 3 people for 4 days. The math is straightforward and depressing. You're producing 50% more carbon dioxide than the system was designed to handle, and you need it to work for twice as long as it was designed to work. It's like trying to use a water filter designed for a weekend camping trip to purify water for a small city for a week. Houston, we're getting high carbon dioxide readings, Fred Hayes reports on the 2nd day after the explosion, reading numbers from instruments that are telling him something he doesn't want to hear. High carbon dioxide readings are space talk for we're slowly poisoning ourselves with our own breath, and if we don't fix this soon, we're going to die in a way that's particularly unpleasant. Carbon dioxide poisoning doesn't kill you quickly and dramatically, like an explosion or rapid decompression. It kills you slowly and gradually while making you feel progressively worse. First, you get headaches that feel like someone is tightening a band around your skull. Then you get confused and have trouble thinking clearly, which is problematic when your survival depends on making good decisions about complex technical problems. Then you get drowsy and want to sleep, which sounds pleasant until you realize that the drowsiness is caused by your brain being slowly poisoned. Finally, you stop breathing without realizing you've stopped breathing, which is the kind of death that sneaks up on you while you're busy worrying about other ways to die. The solution involves engineering improvisation that would make MacGyver weep with admiration and probably quit his job to become an astronaut. The command module has lithium hydroxide canisters that could solve the carbon dioxide problem, but they're in the powered-down command module, and they're square-shaped canisters designed to fit into round openings in the lunar module's life support system. It's literally trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, except the peg is your life support system and the hole is the difference between breathing and not breathing. We need to figure out how to put a square peg in a round hole. Gene Kranz tells his engineers in a conference room in Mission Control, where teams of very smart people are about to solve a problem they never imagined they'd need to solve. This is not a philosophical problem or a metaphorical challenge. This is an immediate practical problem that needs to be solved using only the materials available on the spacecraft, which include duct tape, plastic bags, cardboard, and whatever else the astronauts can find floating around in the lunar module. The engineers in Houston work for hours to develop a procedure that will save 3 lives using materials that were never intended to save lives. They test everything using materials identical to what's available on the spacecraft. They build prototypes and test them and modify them and test them again until they're confident the procedure will work. They make sure it works reliably before they transmit the instructions to the astronauts, because there's no room for error when the error could result in death by carbon dioxide poisoning. The procedure involves using duct tape to attach a plastic bag to a lithium hydroxide canister from the command module, and then somehow fitting the whole contraption into the lunar module's life support system using materials that look like they came from a hardware store clearance sale. It's like performing surgery using household tools while wearing oven mitts and hoping that your patient doesn't die while you figure out how everything connects together. Okay guys, here's what we need you to do. Jack Luzma radios to the spacecraft with a step-by-step explanation that sounds like instructions for building a science fair project, except this science fair project needs to work perfectly or 3 people die in space. What follows is the most important arts and crafts session in the history of human spaceflight. The instructions are precise, because they have to be. One mistake in assembly, and you get to experience what carbon dioxide poisoning feels like in zero gravity, which doesn't feel pleasant in any gravity. You spend several hours following the instructions from Houston like you're assembling furniture from a store that specializes in life or death furniture that doesn't come with extra screws. Cut the plastic bag here using scissors that were designed for cutting food packages, not for emergency life support modifications. Attach the duct tape there, making sure the seal is airtight, because leaks in this particular application mean death rather than just inconvenience. Connect this tube to that opening and hope that air flows the way it's supposed to flow according to the laws of physics and the prayers of 3 astronauts who really want to keep breathing. The improvised carbon dioxide scrubber looks like something a child might build if that child had access to spacecraft materials and was trying to win a science fair project on the theme of desperate improvisation in desperate improvisation, life-threatening situations using only materials found in a space capsule. It's ugly and awkward and held together with duct tape and hope, but it represents the difference between life and death for 3 people who are 200,000 miles from the nearest hardware store. But it works. The carbon dioxide levels drop back to safe ranges where you can breathe without slowly poisoning yourselves with your own exhalations. It's a victory, but it's a small victory in a situation that requires many victories just to survive until tomorrow. You still have 3 days to go, and the problems are just getting started. Each problem you solve reveals new problems that need solving, like a deadly version of those nested Russian dolls, where each doll contains another doll that wants to kill you. Power becomes the next crisis, in a cascade of crises that seem designed to test every aspect of your survival skills. The lunar module's electrical systems are running on batteries that were designed to support a moon landing mission lasting about 33 hours, not a 4-day survival marathon in deep space. Every system that draws power is consuming batteries that you'll need for guidance, navigation, and life support during the final approach to Earth. It's like trying to make your phone battery last for a week when it was designed to last for a day, and also your life depends on your phone working when you need it most. The power consumption calculations are depressing in the way that math can be depressing when the numbers don't add up to survival. The guidance computer draws power. The life support fans draw power. The communication systems draw power. The instrument displays draw power. Even the lights draw power. And in space you need lights because outside your spacecraft it's darker than the darkest night you've ever experienced on Earth. Add up all the power consumption and you get numbers that suggest you'll run out of electricity about 12 hours before you reach Earth. We need to power down everything that's not essential. Jim Lovell tells his crewmates as they look at power consumption data that reads like a countdown to death by electrical failure. Defining essential in a spacecraft is trickier than it sounds when almost everything serves some critical function. Is the cabin heater essential? Not immediately, but after a few days in a spacecraft that's getting colder by the hour, heat starts looking pretty essential for maintaining the manual dexterity needed to operate controls and solve problems. Is the navigation computer essential? Absolutely, but only when you're trying to figure out where you are and where you're going. The rest of the time it's just consuming power you need to save for later. But how do you know when later is if you don't know where you are? It's like trying to conserve water during a drought while not knowing how long the drought will last or when you'll find more water. The temperature inside the lunar module drops to about 45 degrees Fahrenheit as systems shut down and the cold of space begins to penetrate the spacecraft's thermal protection. That's cold enough to make you uncomfortable in a way that makes it hard to concentrate on complex problems. It's also humid because water vapor from your breath is condensing on the cold walls of the spacecraft, creating a layer of moisture that makes everything damp and unpleasant. You're living in conditions that combine the worst aspects of camping in winter with the worst aspects of being trapped in a small space with two other people who are also cold, uncomfortable, worried about dying, and running out of patience with the situation. Personal space doesn't exist in the lunar module. Privacy doesn't exist either. Every conversation is heard by everyone. Every mistake is witnessed by everyone. Every moment of doubt or fear is shared whether you want to share it or not. Water becomes another problem in your growing collection of problems that need solving before they kill you. The lunar module has a limited water supply and no way to replenish it because the water recycling systems that exist on Earth don't exist in spacecraft in 1970. Every drop you drink is a drop that won't be available later. Every drop you use for rehydrating food is a drop that might be needed for something more critical, like cooling the electronics that keep you alive, or mixing with chemicals for the carbon dioxide scrubbers. Water rationing in space is like water rationing on Earth, except there's no rain coming, and the nearest lake is 200,000 miles away. And also it's frozen solid because space is really, really cold. You need water for drinking to avoid dehydration, which impairs your ability to think clearly about problems that require clear thinking. You need water for food preparation because dehydrated space food is already barely edible and becomes completely inedible without proper rehydration. You need water for cooling the spacecraft's electronics because overheated electronics fail in ways that can kill you. We're going to have to cut water consumption, Fred Hayes announces after checking the water levels and doing math that shows you're using water faster than you can afford to use it. Water consumption in space includes drinking water for the crew, water for food preparation, and water for cooling the spacecraft's electronics and environmental systems. Cut the water for cooling, and your electronics overheat and fail. Cut the water for food preparation, and you eat dry food that tastes even worse than rehydrated space food, which is saying something. Cut the drinking water, and you get dehydrated, which makes everything else harder to deal with, and impairs your judgment when you need good judgment most. The water rationing means you're constantly thirsty in a way that makes you think about water more than you think about anything else except maybe surviving. Thirst is distracting when you need to focus on complex technical problems. It's also demoralizing when you're surrounded by equipment that contains water for cooling, but you can't drink it because that water contains chemicals that would poison you faster than dehydration would kill you. Sleep becomes impossible under these conditions in ways that make you understand why sleep deprivation is considered a form of torture. You're cold, which makes it hard to relax. You're worried about survival, which makes it hard to quiet your mind. You're in an environment that makes noise every time anything happens, which is constantly because life support systems never stop running and they're not designed for quiet operation. You're trying to sleep while floating in a sleeping bag attached to a wall in a metal can that's traveling through space at 25,000 miles per hour while making mechanical noises that could indicate normal operation or imminent catastrophe. It's like trying to sleep in a refrigerator during an earthquake while wearing a sleeping bag and worrying about whether you'll live to see tomorrow while listening to sounds that might mean everything is fine or might mean you're about to die. Anyone getting any sleep? Jack Swigert asks during what would normally be nighttime, if you were on Earth and if day and night had any meaning, when you're traveling through space where the sun never sets and never rises because you're not rotating, relative to anything that creates day and night cycles. But you're not on Earth. You're in space where circadian rhythms have been destroyed by the combination of zero gravity, artificial lighting, and the knowledge that you're entirely dependent on technology that seems determined to break at the worst possible moments. Not really, Jim replies with the exhaustion of someone who's been awake for too long while dealing with problems that require alertness and clear thinking. Hard to sleep when you're trying to figure out if we have enough consumables to make it home, and whether the spacecraft will hold together long enough to get us there, and what we'll do if something else breaks. Consumables is NASA speak for everything you need to stay alive while traveling through an environment that wants to kill you. Oxygen for breathing, water for drinking and cooling, electrical power for life support and navigation, food for maintaining enough energy to operate complex equipment, and the will to live when everything seems designed to crush your spirit. The first four are quantifiable using math and engineering calculations. The will to live is harder to calculate but just as important for survival. Lose that, and all the oxygen and water in the solar system won't help you make it home alive. The food situation becomes increasingly grim as the days pass and your appetite disappears under the stress of trying not to die in space. You're eating less to conserve water for rehydration because dry space food requires water to become edible. You're eating less to conserve power for food preparation because heating food requires electricity. You're eating less because everything tastes terrible when you're cold, stressed, worried about survival, and wondering if your next meal might be your last meal. Space food that was merely unappetizing on the first day becomes barely tolerable by the third day when you're hungry enough to eat almost anything, but not quite hungry enough to enjoy eating almost anything. The beef stew still tastes like beef-flavored paste, mixed with disappointment. The turkey and gravy still resembles turkey and gravy in the same way that cardboard resembles fine dining. The chocolate pudding still tastes like chocolate-flavored regret, with a consistency that suggests someone mixed cocoa powder with sadness and hope. This is supposed to be spaghetti, Fred says, looking at a bag of something that resembles spaghetti, in the same way that string resembles pasta, when you're desperate enough to call anything with a similar shape by the name of food you actually want to eat. I think it's actually glue mixed with crushed dreams and a faint memory of what tomatoes used to taste like. Could be worse. Jack replies with the kind of optimism that develops when your standards for food have been lowered to technically edible and probably won't kill you faster than the other things trying to kill you. Could be the shrimp cocktail, which tastes like shrimp-flavored betrayal mixed with the tears of whoever designed this menu. Space food in 1970 is what happens when food scientists collaborate with people who have never heard of flavor and don't plan to learn about it anytime soon. Everything is processed to the point where it barely resembles food and tastes even less like food than it looks. The spaghetti tastes like pasta-flavored paste that someone mixed with vague memories of Italian cuisine. The shrimp cocktail tastes like shrimp-flavored disappointment that makes you question life choices. The beef stew tastes like beef-flavored regret that makes you wonder why you didn't become an accountant instead of an astronaut. The psychological pressure starts getting to everyone by the third day when the novelty of being in space has worn off and been replaced by the reality of trying not to die in space. You're living in close quarters with two other people who are also stressed, tired, cold, hungry, thirsty, and worried about survival. Personal space doesn't exist in the lunar module, which is smaller than most people's bathrooms. Privacy doesn't exist either because every conversation is heard by everyone and every bodily function is witnessed by everyone, whether you want witnesses or not. Getting a little tight in here, Jim observes with the understatement skills that astronauts develop when their job involves experiencing things that normal people can't adequately describe using normal language. It's an understatement of cosmic proportions that makes saying, "It's a bit chilly about Antarctica," sound like accurate weather reporting. 3 people in the lunar module is like 3 people trying to live in a large closet for 4 days while solving engineering problems that require precision and concentration, and while trying not to think about all the ways they might die before they make it home. Personal hygiene becomes both impossible and irrelevant when you're focused on survival rather than social acceptability. You can't shower in zero gravity because water doesn't fall down when there's no down for it to fall toward. You can't brush your teeth properly because spitting doesn't work when gravity isn't available to make things go where you want them to go. You can't change clothes because the lunar module doesn't have a wardrobe or privacy or space for storing extra clothes. After 3 days, Everyone smells like someone who has been living in a metal can without access to running water, soap, deodorant, or basic sanitation facilities. But everyone smells equally bad, so it evens out in a way that would be funny if it weren't happening to you while you're trying not to die. The smell becomes part of the background sensory experience, like the constant mechanical noises and the cold temperature, and the knowledge that you're entirely dependent on technology that might fail at any moment. The waste management situation is about as pleasant as you'd expect when three people are living in a space the size of a small bathroom while using waste management systems that make porta potties seem luxurious and well-designed. The lunar module doesn't have a proper toilet because toilets are heavy and complex, and the lunar module was designed to minimize weight and complexity. Instead, it has waste management systems that are best described as functional rather than comfortable or dignified or anything you'd want to use unless your life depended on it. Using the bathroom in the lunar module is like using the bathroom in the world's most expensive and least convenient porta potty while floating in zero gravity and hoping that everything goes where it's supposed to go, instead of floating around the cabin where other people are trying to eat food that's already barely appetizing. It's a process that requires careful planning, specific equipment, and a sense of humor about bodily functions that most people develop only under extreme circumstances. Medical problems start developing by the fourth day, when the combination of stress, dehydration, poor nutrition, lack of sleep, and living in cramped conditions begins to affect everyone's health in ways that would be concerning on Earth and are potentially life-threatening in space. Fred Hayes develops a urinary tract infection, which is not a minor inconvenience when you're in space, and medical care consists of whatever supplies are available in the spacecraft's medical kit. This is not something you can ignore and hope it gets better because infections don't get better on their own, and untreated infections can become life-threatening faster than you might expect. But there's no way to treat it properly with the medical supplies available on the spacecraft, which were designed for treating minor injuries and common spaceflight problems, not infections that develop during extended survival situations that nobody planned for. "How are you feeling?" Jim asks Fred, who has been looking increasingly uncomfortable as the hours pass and the infection gets worse instead of better. It's the kind of question that sounds casual but carries the weight of genuine concern for someone's survival when medical help is not available and won't be available for another day and a half, assuming everything else goes according to plan. Like I need medical attention that's not available for another day and a half? Fred replies with the honesty that develops when you're too tired and uncomfortable to maintain polite social conventions about not complaining. But I'll manage because what choice do I have when the nearest hospital is 200,000 miles away and I can't call for an ambulance? Managing in space is different from managing on Earth in ways that make you appreciate how easy most problems are when you have access to resources and professional help. On Earth, if you feel sick, you can rest in bed, drink fluids, take medication, see a doctor, and generally take care of yourself using resources that are readily available. In space, if you feel sick, you still need to help solve engineering problems that determine whether everyone lives or dies, because there's no calling in sick when your workplace is a crippled spacecraft and your co-workers' lives depend on your ability to function despite feeling terrible. Navigation becomes increasingly critical as you approach the moon and prepare for the slingshot maneuver that will either send you home to Earth or into deep space depending on whether you get the math right. The guidance computer in the lunar module needs to know exactly where you are and exactly where you're going with precision that makes GPS navigation look casual and approximate. But the explosion damaged some of the navigation equipment in the command module, and the lunar module's navigation system wasn't designed for this type of mission. The computer is working with incomplete information and making calculations based on assumptions that might not be correct because some of the sensors that provide position and velocity data are in the damaged command module. It's like trying to navigate using a GPS that might be off by a few hundred miles, and also your destination is moving at 17,000 miles per hour, and if you miss it by even a small amount, you'll never get another chance to correct your course. We need to do some manual navigation, Jim tells his crewmates as he prepares to use techniques that were developed for ocean navigation and adapted for space exploration. Manual navigation in space involves using a sextant to measure the angles between celestial objects and then doing calculations that would make high school math teachers weep with despair, and college astronomy professors question their career choices. It's astronomy combined with trigonometry, combined with the pressure of knowing that if you get the math wrong, you'll miss Earth entirely and drift off into space to become the solar system's most expensive and disappointing piece of space debris. The calculations need to be precise enough to hit a target that's moving at thousands of miles per hour from a distance of hundreds of thousands of miles while traveling at speeds that make commercial aviation look like pedestrian traffic. The sextant is an instrument that was designed for navigation on Earth's oceans by sailors who needed to know their position within a few miles and had plenty of time to take multiple measurements and average out the errors. Using it in space is like using a compass underwater while riding a roller coaster and trying to navigate to a specific parking space in a city you've never visited. It works, but it requires adaptation and interpretation that goes well beyond what the instrument was designed for. "I'm getting a reading on the Earth's horizon," Jim reports as he peers through the sextant and tries to measure angles between Earth and stars that are visible in the permanent darkness of space. The Earth's horizon from 200,000 miles away is not the same as the Earth's horizon from sea level or even from high-altitude aircraft. It's a thin blue line that represents the difference between the atmosphere that keeps people alive and the vacuum of space that kills people instantly. It's also the line that represents home and safety and everything you're trying to get back to while traveling through an environment that wants to kill you in creative ways. The horizon looks impossibly thin and fragile from this distance, like a soap bubble floating in infinite darkness. It's hard to believe that something so delicate-looking contains everyone you've ever known and every place you've ever been and everything that makes life worth living. The calculations take hours of careful work while dealing with the distraction of being cold, tired, hungry, thirsty, and worried about survival. You're measuring angles between celestial objects that are millions of miles apart, checking reference tables that were compiled by astronomers who never expected them to be used for emergency navigation in crippled spacecraft, and doing arithmetic that has to be perfect because there's no room for error when you're calculating a trajectory that will determine whether you live or die. Too steep an angle of approach and you burn up like a meteor when you hit Earth's atmosphere at 25,000 miles per hour. Too shallow an angle and you skip off the atmosphere like a stone skipping on water, except instead of splashing into water, you drift off into space forever with a very limited supply of everything you need to stay alive. The margin for error is measured in degrees that seem large until you realize you're trying to hit those angles from a distance that makes precision archery look easy and forgiving. By the fourth day, everyone is exhausted, dehydrated, cold, hungry, and running on adrenaline and determination, and whatever reserves of mental and physical energy you develop when your survival depends on continuing to function despite feeling terrible. The spacecraft is consuming the last of its expendable resources, like a car running on fumes while trying to reach a gas station that might not exist. The batteries are nearly drained. The water supply is almost gone. The oxygen is holding out, but barely, and only because you've been breathing as little as possible while still maintaining consciousness. It's like running a marathon where the finish line keeps moving further away. And also, if you don't finish the race, you die. And also, you're running the marathon while solving complex technical problems that require clear thinking and precise execution. Every step forward requires effort that you're not sure you have, but stopping isn't an option, because stopping means dying, and dying means failing, not just yourself, but the people who are depending on you to make good decisions under impossible pressure. "Houston, we're beginning our approach for re-entry," Jim reports as Earth grows larger in the window and begins to look like a destination rather than just a distant target. Earth from space looks beautiful and peaceful, and completely unaware that 3 of its inhabitants are struggling to get back to its surface alive while flying in a spacecraft that's held together by engineering skill. improvised repairs, and hope. The blue and white marble hanging in space represents everything you've ever known, everyone you've ever loved, every place you've ever been, and every experience that makes you human. It's home in a way that you never appreciated when you were standing on its surface, breathing its air and drinking its water, and taking for granted that you could walk outside without worrying about life support systems or radiation, or the vacuum of space. But you're not home yet, and you won't be home until you successfully complete the most dangerous part of any space mission, even when everything is working properly. Re-entry is the process of hitting Earth's atmosphere at exactly the right angle, at exactly the right speed, at exactly the right time, or else all the survival efforts of the past 4 days become meaningless, and you become a brief firework display over the Pacific Ocean that nobody will see because it happens too high and too fast for casual observation. The command module needs to be powered up for re-entry, which means turning on systems that have been shut down for days to conserve power, and hoping that the cold temperatures and electrical stress haven't damaged electronic components that were designed to operate in controlled environments. It means trusting that systems will work when you need them most, after being subjected to conditions they were never designed to handle while you were busy trying not to die in space. Power-up sequence initiated. Jack Swigert reports as he begins the process of bringing the command module back to life like a doctor trying to revive a patient who has been in a coma for days. The checklist for powering up a spacecraft is longer than the instruction manual for most cars, and more critical than the startup procedure for most power plants. Every system has to be checked. Every component has to be tested. Every function has to be verified. And it all has to be done correctly, because there's no second chance if something doesn't work during re-entry. The electrical systems come online slowly like an old computer booting up after being unplugged for too long. Some components work perfectly, which is encouraging. Others work partially, which is concerning. A few don't work at all, which is terrifying when you consider that you need most of these systems to survive the next few hours. The explosion 4 days ago damaged more than just the oxygen tanks and fuel cells. It damaged systems throughout the service module, and some of those damaged systems are now affecting the command module's ability to function normally. We're showing some anomalies in the electrical system, Jack reports to Houston with the calm professionalism that astronauts develop when reporting problems that could kill them. Anomalies is NASA speak for things are not working the way they're supposed to work, and we're not sure why, and we're hoping it's not important enough to kill us during re-entry. In space, anomalies can be anything from minor inconveniences that don't affect mission success to life-threatening emergencies that require immediate action to prevent death. The trick is figuring out which type of anomaly you're dealing with before it's too late to do anything about it. Some anomalies are like warning lights in your car that indicate something needs attention but won't prevent you from driving home. Other anomalies are like warning lights that indicate your engine is about to explode and you need to stop immediately. In space, most anomalies fall into the second category because there's very little redundancy in the systems that keep you alive. The heat shield becomes the next source of anxiety in your growing collection of things to worry about while approaching Earth at speeds that make supersonic aircraft look leisurely. The heat shield is what protects you from burning up during re-entry when your spacecraft hits Earth's atmosphere at 25,000 miles per hour, and friction generates temperatures that would melt most metals and definitely melt human beings who aren't protected by heat shields that work properly. But the explosion might have damaged the heat shield attachment points, or the heat shield itself, and there's no way to inspect it while you're in space because it's on the bottom of the command module, and you're inside the command module. If the heat shield is damaged, re-entry becomes a very expensive form of cremation that happens at extremely high altitude while traveling at speeds that make the whole process very brief and very final. We can't tell if the heat shield is damaged. Gene Kranz tells his flight controllers in mission control with the kind of statement that sounds calm and professional but actually means we're about to find out if these 3 guys survive or become space debris in the most spectacular way possible. There's no diagnostic test for heat shield integrity that can be performed in space. You have to trust that it's intact, and hope that trust is justified when you're traveling through Earth's atmosphere at speeds that generate enough heat to melt steel. There's no way to inspect the heat shield while you're in space because getting out to look at it would require a spacewalk. And spacewalks are complicated, procedures that require equipment you don't have and time. You can't spare an expertise that's difficult to apply when you're dealing with damaged spacecraft systems and limited resources. You have to trust that the heat shield is intact and functional and capable of protecting you during re-entry, or else you become a very brief meteor with delusions of grandeur and 3 very disappointed passengers. The lunar module has to be jettisoned before re-entry because it would interfere with the aerodynamics of re-entry, and also because it's no longer needed now that you're switching back to the command module for the final approach to Earth. This is like saying goodbye to the lifeboat that saved your life during the worst 4 days you've ever experienced. For 4 days, the lunar module kept you alive when the command module couldn't. Now you have to abandon it and trust that the command module will work well enough to get you safely to Earth's surface. It's like switching from a leaky boat to a boat that might not be leaky while you're still in the middle of the ocean and the nearest Coast Guard station is thousands of miles away. The lunar module will drift away into space and eventually crash into the Pacific Ocean thousands of miles from where you plan to land. Assuming you successfully land instead of burning up during re-entry or missing Earth entirely and becoming permanent residents of deep space. Lunar module jettison in 30 seconds, Jim announces as he prepares to separate from the spacecraft that served as home and life support system and salvation for 4 days of desperate survival. The lunar module Aquarius has served its purpose, but now it's just extra weight that would interfere with re-entry and compromise your chances of survival during the most dangerous part of the mission. Watching it drift away is like watching your life support system disappear into space while hoping you won't need it again and knowing you'll never see it again. Re-entry begins when you hit Earth's atmosphere at an altitude of about 400,000 feet, which is so high that it barely qualifies as atmosphere, but is thick enough to start slowing down your spacecraft through friction that generates heat that would kill you if you weren't protected by a heat shield that you hope is working properly. At that altitude, Earth's atmosphere is so thin that you can't breathe it, but it's thick enough to start the process that will either bring you safely home or kill you in a spectacular fireball that will be visible from hundreds of miles away. Friction generates heat that reaches temperatures of several thousand degrees Fahrenheit, which is hot enough to melt most metals and definitely hot enough to vaporize human beings who aren't protected by heat shields designed by people who understand thermodynamics better than most people understand their own names. The heat shield converts that heat into a plasma trail that makes you look like a shooting star to anyone watching from the ground, except shooting stars don't contain 3 people who are hoping to survive the experience. The G-forces during re-entry are brutal in ways that make the launch seem comfortable and gentle by comparison. You go from weightlessness to weighing several times your normal body weight in a matter of minutes that feel like hours. Your organs shift inside your ribcage like loose cargo in a truck that's going around corners too fast. Your blood pools in parts of your body where it's not supposed to pool, making you feel like your cardiovascular system is failing while you're already dealing with enough stress to make normal people pass out. Your vision tunnels as your cardiovascular system struggles to pump blood against the increased gravity that makes everything weigh more than it's supposed to weigh. It's like being inside a centrifuge designed by someone who doesn't particularly care about your comfort or survival and is mainly interested in testing the limits of human endurance under extreme conditions. The acceleration makes it difficult to move your arms, to operate controls that need to be operated precisely to ensure successful re-entry. Communication goes dead during the most intense part of re-entry when you need communication most, but can't have it because physics doesn't care about your communication needs. The plasma around your spacecraft blocks radio signals like a blanket made of superheated gas that prevents electromagnetic waves from reaching mission control. For several minutes, you're completely cut off from Houston. Mission Control can't talk to you. You can't talk to Mission Control. You're alone inside a fireball traveling at speeds that would make jet pilots envious while hoping that physics works the way it's supposed to work and that your heat shield holds together long enough to get you safely through the atmosphere. Come on, guys. Talk to us, Jack Lousma says into his microphone in mission control. But you can't hear him because you're too busy experiencing what it feels like to be inside a controlled explosion while traveling fast enough to circle the Earth in an hour and a half. The radio silence lasts about 4 minutes, which is the longest 4 minutes in the history of space exploration for everyone involved. 4 minutes that feel like 4 hours to the people in mission control, and 4 days to the people inside the spacecraft who are hoping they'll survive long enough to talk to anyone ever again. The silence is broken when your parachutes deploy with a jolt that reminds you that you're still alive and still have a chance of staying that way if everything continues to work properly for just a little while longer. 3 enormous parachutes slow your descent from terminal velocity to something that won't kill you when you hit the ocean. Assuming the parachutes work properly, and the ocean is where you're supposed to land instead of somewhere else entirely. The parachutes are your last line of defense against gravity, and your first indication that you might actually survive this whole ordeal that started 4 days ago, with an explosion, and continued with every possible challenge that space travel can present to 3 people who just want to get home alive. If the parachutes don't work, you become the most expensive crater in the Pacific Ocean, and a cautionary tale about what happens when everything that can go wrong does go wrong in space. There they are, someone shouts in mission control as radar picks up your spacecraft, descending under parachutes like a very expensive package being delivered by the world's most unreliable shipping service. After 4 days of crisis management that tested every aspect of human ingenuity and determination, someone in Houston is finally allowed to feel optimistic about your chances of survival. You're still traveling toward the ocean at about 25 feet per second, which is fast enough to hurt but slow enough that you probably won't die on impact if everything goes according to plan. The ocean landing is not gentle because spacecraft are not designed for gentle landings, and the ocean is not designed to provide soft surfaces for landing spacecraft that were built like metal cans, designed to survive explosions rather than water landings. Splashing down in the Pacific Ocean at 25 feet per second is like being inside a car that hits a brick wall, except the brick wall is made of water and the car is a metal capsule that just survived re-entry through Earth's atmosphere while protecting 3 people who have been through experiences that will give them nightmares for the rest. The impact throws you against your restraints with enough force to remind you that gravity is not always your friend, and that even successful spacecraft recoveries involve more violence than most people experience in their entire lives. But you're alive, which is more than you expected 4 days ago when oxygen tanks were exploding and life support systems were failing and everyone was trying to figure out how to keep 3 people alive in a spacecraft that was designed to take them to the moon, but ended up taking them on a tour of survival techniques that most people never need to learn. You're floating in the Pacific Ocean inside a spacecraft that somehow held together through 4 days of crisis management and a re-entry that should have killed you 3 different ways. The command module bobs on the ocean surface like the world's most expensive life raft that contains 3 people who have just survived the most dangerous 4 days in the history of human spaceflight. Water sloshes against the hull with sounds that are almost musical after 4 days of mechanical noises and electrical humming and the constant awareness that you're entirely dependent on technology that might fail at any moment. Odyssey, this is Recovery One, comes a voice over the radio that sounds like the most beautiful voice you've ever heard because it represents contact with people who can help you and safety, and the end of 4 days of wondering whether you'll live to hear another human voice. Recovery One is the aircraft carrier USS Iwo Jima, which is about 4 miles away from your splashdown point. 4 miles counts as a bullseye in the world of spacecraft recovery operations, where hitting the right ocean is considered successful navigation, and landing within a few miles of the recovery ships is considered precision targeting. 4 miles is close enough that the recovery divers can reach you in a matter of minutes instead of hours, which is important when you're floating in the ocean in a spacecraft that's designed for space travel rather than extended ocean voyaging. The recovery operation has been planned and rehearsed, but recovery operations always include variables that can't be planned for, like weather conditions and equipment failures, and the possibility that the astronauts inside the spacecraft might be unconscious or injured or dead. The recovery divers attach a flotation collar around your spacecraft to keep it stable in the ocean swells that remind you that you're now subject to weather conditions instead of the controlled environment of space travel. They also attach a line that will allow the aircraft carrier to winch you out of the water, like the world's most valuable catch of the day. Being winched out of the ocean while inside a spacecraft is exactly as uncomfortable as it sounds, and about as dignified as you might expect when you're being pulled up the side of a ship while inside a metal can that wasn't designed for this type of handling. It's like being inside a washing machine that someone is pulling up the side of a building using a very large crane, operated by people who are trying to be careful but are also dealing with ocean swells and wind conditions and the fact that spacecraft are heavier than most things that get winched out of the ocean. The whole process is loud and violent and uncomfortable, but it's also the final step in a journey that started with controlled explosions and continued with survival techniques that nobody should ever need to use while traveling through space. "Welcome back to Earth," one of the recovery divers says as he opens the command module hatch and fresh air rushes into the spacecraft for the first time in 4 days. Real air that wasn't recycled through life support systems that were pushed far beyond their design limits. Air that smells like ocean and salt spray instead of metal and human desperation, and the lingering odor of 3 people who have been living in a confined space while trying not to die. It's the best air you've ever breathed, and you've been breathing air your entire life without appreciating how amazing it is when you're not worried about running out of it. The smell of the ocean is overwhelming after 4 days of breathing recycled air that smelled like machinery and stress, and the fear that comes with knowing you're entirely dependent on technology that might fail at any moment. The salt spray feels like luxury after 4 days of rationing water and wondering whether you'll have enough to drink to stay alive until you reach safety. The sound of waves against the spacecraft hull is like music after 4 days of mechanical noises, and the constant hum of life support systems that never stopped working, but never stopped reminding you that they might stop working at any moment. Getting out of the spacecraft after 4 days in zero gravity is like learning to walk all over again while also feeling like you've been hit by a truck that was driven by someone who really didn't like you and wanted to make you sure you understood that. Your legs don't remember how to support your body weight because they haven't had to support your body weight for 4 days. Your balance is completely shot because your inner ear has been confused by zero gravity and doesn't know which way is up anymore. Your cardiovascular system has to readjust to pumping blood against gravity instead of just circulating it through a weightless body. It's like being drunk, except instead of alcohol, you're intoxicated by 4 days of stress and microgravity and the kind of relief that comes with surviving something that should have killed you. Everything feels heavy because everything is heavy when you're used to everything being weightless. Your arms feel like they're made of lead. Your head feels like it weighs 50 pounds. Your legs feel like they belong to someone else who never learned how to walk properly. The medical examination aboard the aircraft carrier reveals what 4 days of survival in space does to the human body when that survival involves rationing food and water while living in cold conditions and dealing with stress levels that would break most people who aren't trained astronauts. You've lost weight because you couldn't eat properly when your food options ranged from barely edible to completely unappetizing, and you were too worried about survival to maintain a normal appetite. You're dehydrated because you had to ration water to make sure you had enough for cooling critical electronics and mixing with chemicals for the carbon dioxide scrubbers that kept you alive by removing the poison you exhaled with. Every breath. You have muscle atrophy because you couldn't exercise in the confined space of the lunar module where moving around meant bumping into critical equipment or other people who were also trying to move around in a space too small for 3 people. Fred Hayes still has his urinary tract infection, which now requires actual medical treatment with real antibiotics dispensed by real doctors instead of just hoping it doesn't get worse while you're busy trying not to die in space. The infection developed because of the stress and dehydration and living conditions that would make a medieval peasant complain about the accommodations. It's treatable now that he has access to medical care, but it serves as a reminder that human bodies aren't designed for extended survival in spacecraft that are pushed beyond their design limits. How do you feel? The flight surgeon asks, as he checks your vital signs with instruments that are more sophisticated than anything available on the spacecraft and operated by people who actually know how to interpret the results without having to consult engineering manuals written by people who never expected them to be used for emergency medical care in survival situations. Like I just spent 4 days trying not to die in space. Jim Lovell replies with the honesty that comes with being too tired to maintain social conventions about not complaining. Other than that, pretty good, considering we're alive when we probably should be dead, and floating in space, as examples of what happens when everything that can go wrong does go wrong at the worst possible time. The debriefing sessions begin almost immediately because NASA needs to understand exactly what went wrong, when it went wrong, how it went wrong, and how to prevent it from going wrong again in future missions that might face similar challenges. Every decision made during the crisis is analyzed by teams of engineers who want to understand the decision-making process that kept 3 people alive when all the normal procedures and backup systems failed simultaneously. Every procedure is reviewed to determine whether it worked as intended or whether it needed to be modified under emergency conditions that nobody had anticipated during the design process. Every communication between the spacecraft and mission control is transcribed and studied by teams of engineers who want to make sure future astronauts don't have to go through the same experience or, if they do, that they have better procedures and better equipment for dealing with situations that shouldn't happen but sometimes do anyway. The investigation into the explosion reveals a series of small problems that combine to create one large catastrophe that nearly killed 3 astronauts and destroyed a mission that took years to plan and millions of dollars to execute. The oxygen tank that exploded had been damaged during a pre-flight test procedure months before the mission. The damage was minor enough that it didn't show up in routine inspections that were designed to catch obvious problems rather than subtle damage that might cause failures under specific conditions. But the damage was significant enough that when combined with the normal stresses of spaceflight and the specific conditions present during the mission, it caused a failure that nearly killed 3 astronauts and turned a routine moon mission into a survival exercise that tested every aspect of human ingenuity and determination. It's a perfect example of how complex systems can fail in ways that are impossible to predict, even when every component is tested individually and every procedure is reviewed by experts. It was a cascade failure. The lead investigator explains to a room full of NASA officials who are trying to understand how something like this could happen, despite all the testing and quality control procedures that are supposed to prevent exactly this type of failure. Multiple small problems that individually wouldn't have been dangerous, but together created a situation that was almost catastrophic and could easily have been completely catastrophic if any number of small things had gone differently. This is how most disasters happen, whether they involve spacecraft or airplanes or nuclear power plants or any other complex system where human lives depend on everything working properly. Not because of one dramatic failure that everyone can see coming, but because of multiple small failures that interact with each other in ways that nobody anticipated during the design process. The explosion on Apollo 13 wasn't caused by a single defective component that anyone could have identified and replaced before the mission. It was caused by a defective component that interacted with normal operating procedures in a way that created an abnormal and dangerous situation that escalated beyond the ability of normal safety systems to contain it. The thermal insulation around the oxygen tank wiring had been damaged during the pre-flight test when someone made a small mistake that seemed insignificant at the time. The damaged insulation allowed electrical arcs to form when the tank heater was turned on during normal pre-flight operations. The electrical arcs ignited the insulation, which wasn't supposed to be flammable but became flammable when it was damaged in ways that weren't obvious during visual inspections. The burning insulation raised the pressure inside the tank beyond its design limits, which were supposed to be adequate for any normal operating condition. but weren't adequate for the abnormal conditions created by burning insulation inside a high-pressure oxygen environment. The tank exploded with enough force to damage other critical systems throughout the service module, including the second oxygen tank, the fuel cells that generated electricity, and the water systems that provided cooling for electronics and drinking water for the crew. Any one of these problems by itself could have been managed or worked around using backup systems and emergency procedures that had been developed for individual component failures. But all of them happening in sequence created a situation that turned a routine moon mission into a survival exercise that required solutions that had never been developed because nobody had imagined this particular combination of failures could happen all at once. It's like a chain reaction where each link makes the next link more likely to fail until the entire chain breaks at the worst possible moment when you're furthest from help and most dependent on everything working properly. The psychological impact of the mission becomes apparent in the weeks and months following the flight, when all three astronauts report difficulty sleeping and problems with concentration and anxiety about situations that never bothered them before the mission. They have dreams about spacecraft malfunctions where they wake up checking to make sure they can breathe properly and that the room they're sleeping in has adequate ventilation and that the air they're breathing isn't being recycled through systems that might fail at any moment. They've experienced what it's like to be entirely dependent on technology for survival, and to have that technology fail when they needed it most. They know what it feels like to be in a situation where every decision matters, and most decisions could be your last decision if you make them incorrectly. They understand in a way that most people never will, what it means to be in a place where help is not coming and rescue is not possible, and survival depends entirely on your ability to work with the resources you have available. You don't really appreciate Earth until you've spent 4 days thinking you might never see it again. Fred Hayes says during one of his post-flight interviews with reporters who are trying to understand what the experience was like for people who lived through it. Everything here seems precious now. The air, the water, the fact that you can walk outside without worrying about life support systems or radiation, or the vacuum of space that wants to kill you in ways you never imagined when you were safely on the ground. The mission is officially classified as a successful failure by NASA administrators who need to categorize an outcome that doesn't fit neatly into normal categories of success and failure. Successful because the crew survived an experience that should have killed them and returned safely to Earth with valuable lessons about spacecraft design and emergency procedures. Failure because they never made it to the moon, which was the primary objective of the mission and the reason why millions of dollars were spent and thousands of people worked for years to make the mission possible. It's a classification that captures the strange nature of what happened during those 4 days in April 1970. The primary mission objective failed completely and spectacularly when an oxygen tank exploded and turned a moon landing mission into a survival exercise. But the secondary objective of keeping the crew alive succeeded in ways that required more skill, more creativity, and more determination than landing on the moon would have required under normal circumstances. The engineering improvisation that saved the mission becomes legendary in aerospace circles and gets studied in engineering schools as an example of creative problem-solving under impossible pressure. The square peg in round hole carbon dioxide scrubber becomes a symbol of what can be accomplished when smart people work together under pressure that would break most teams. The procedure for building it gets added to NASA's Emergency Procedures Manual and future spacecraft carry materials, specifically designed for this type of improvisation. We proved that we can solve problems we've never seen before using materials we never intended for the purpose. Gene Kranz tells his flight controllers after the mission in a debriefing session that will be remembered as one of the defining moments in NASA's history. That's not just good engineering. That's good thinking under pressure. That's what happens when you refuse to accept failure as an option, even when failure seems like the most likely outcome. The public reaction to the mission is mixed in ways that reflect different perspectives on what constitutes success and failure in space exploration. Some people see it as a failure because the astronauts didn't land on the moon, which was what they were supposed to do and what everyone expected them to do when the mission was planned and announced. Others see it as NASA's finest hour because three men survived a situation that should have killed them and demonstrated the value of human creativity and determination in crisis situations. The television coverage of the crisis draws the largest audience in the history of space broadcasting, as people around the world watch and hope and pray for three men they've never met who are trying to get home alive while dealing with problems that most people can't understand, but everyone can relate to on a human level. It's a story about survival and teamwork, and refusing to give up when giving up would be completely understandable and probably more comfortable than continuing to fight against overwhelming odds. The media coverage focuses on the drama and heroism of the rescue, which makes for good television and inspiring headlines, but doesn't capture the complexity of what actually happened during those 4 days. The real story is more complex and more interesting than the simplified version that makes it into newspapers and television reports that need to explain complicated technical problems to audiences who don't have engineering degrees or experience with spacecraft operations. The real story is about how human beings respond to situations that are designed to kill them, and how technology can both fail catastrophically and work magnificently sometimes in the same mission. It's about the importance of training and preparation and teamwork and communication and creative problem-solving, and the willingness to continue working when continuing seems impossible and stopping seems reasonable. The families of the astronauts spend 4 days living with uncertainty that most people never experience and hope they never have to experience. They know their husbands and fathers are in danger. They know the situation is serious. But they don't know from moment to moment whether the next phone call will bring good news or devastating news that will change their lives forever. They're living through their own version of survival stress while trying to maintain normal routines for their children and communities who are also worried but not as directly affected. The hardest part was not knowing, Marilyn Lovell says in interviews years later, when she can talk about the experience without reliving the stress and fear that dominated those 4 days. Jim was either going to come home or he wasn't. But we wouldn't know which one until it was all over. Living with that uncertainty for 4 days was almost as hard as what Jim was going through in space, just in a different way. The mission changes how NASA approaches spacecraft design and mission planning in ways that affect every subsequent space mission. Redundancy becomes more important than efficiency in critical systems. Backup systems get backup systems, even when that means carrying extra weight and complexity. Procedures for emergencies are more detailed and more comprehensive, even when that means longer training programs and more complicated operations manuals. The agency develops protocols for situations that were never considered possible before. Apollo 13 proved that they were not only possible but inevitable, given enough time and enough missions and enough opportunities for small problems to combine into large catastrophes. The protocols include procedures for power management during extended emergencies, water rationing during survival situations, and improvised life support modifications using materials available on spacecraft. The lunar module manufacturer, Grumman Corporation, takes out a full-page advertisement in several major newspapers after the mission with a picture of the lunar module and the caption, "Thanks to the LM for getting our 3 fellows home safely." It's unusual for an aerospace contractor to celebrate a mission that didn't accomplish its primary objective. But the lunar module saved 3 lives in a way that was never part of its design specifications and demonstrated capabilities that nobody knew it had. The advertisement reflects a recognition that sometimes the most important accomplishments are the ones that weren't planned, and sometimes the most valuable demonstrations of engineering capability happen during failures rather than successes. The lunar module was designed to land on the moon, but it ended up serving as a lifeboat that kept 3 people alive in conditions that were never anticipated during the design process. The command module from Apollo 13 is eventually put on display at the Kansas Cosmosphere and Space Center in Hutchinson, Kansas, where visitors can see the spacecraft that carried 3 men through the most dangerous 4 days in the history of human spaceflight. The heat shield shows scorch marks from re-entry that demonstrate how close the spacecraft came to burning up during its return to Earth. The interior shows wear from 4 days of desperate improvisation and creative problem-solving under impossible pressure. It looks like what it is, a machine that was pushed far beyond its design limits and somehow held together long enough to bring its crew home alive. The switches and controls show signs of heavy use during those 4 days when every system was critical and every decision mattered. The improvised carbon dioxide scrubber is displayed alongside the spacecraft as a reminder of what can be accomplished when creative problem-solving meets desperate necessity. The mission becomes a case study in crisis management that is taught in business schools, engineering programs, and leadership development courses around the world. The procedures developed during the crisis become standard emergency protocols for space missions. The communication techniques used between mission control and the spacecraft become models for high-stress decision-making in any field where lives depend on good decisions made quickly under pressure. The collaboration between engineers on Earth and astronauts in space becomes an example of how teams can function effectively under impossible pressure when everyone is committed to the same objective and willing to work together despite stress and fear and uncertainty about the outcome. It demonstrates the importance of training and preparation and clear communication and the willingness to continue working when the work seems impossible and the outcome seems hopeless. But perhaps the most important lesson of Apollo 13 is about the fragility of human life in space and the incredible complexity of the systems required to keep people alive in an environment that is actively hostile to human existence. Every system on a spacecraft serves a critical function. Every component is essential. Every procedure is important. There is no redundancy in human physiology and very little margin for error in the technology that supports human life in space. Space is not like Earth, where you can make mistakes and learn from them and try again with better information and more experience. In space, mistakes can be fatal, and there are no second chances, and very little forgiveness for errors in judgment or equipment failures or problems that develop during missions. The environment of space is specifically designed to kill human beings quickly and efficiently, and only constant vigilance and reliable technology and good decision-making can prevent that from happening. The astronauts of Apollo 13 survived because of a combination of good engineering, creative problem-solving, excellent communication, and what can only be described as luck. They were lucky that the explosion happened when it did, rather than later in the mission when they would have been further from Earth and had less time to solve the problems it created. They were lucky that the lunar module was available as a lifeboat and that it had enough life support capability to keep 3 people alive for 4 days. They were lucky that Mission Control had engineers who could solve problems they had never seen before using materials that were never intended for the solutions they developed. They were lucky that the spacecraft held together despite being damaged and pushed beyond its design limits. They were lucky that the heat shield worked despite the explosion that might have damaged it. They were lucky in dozens of small ways that individually might not have mattered but collectively made the difference between life and death. We were lucky, Jim Lovell admits years later when he can reflect on the experience with the perspective that comes from surviving something that should have killed you. We were well trained and we had good equipment and excellent support from the ground. But we were also lucky. A lot of things could have gone wrong that would have been impossible to fix no matter how smart or dedicated everyone was. The mission demonstrates both the incredible capabilities of human space technology and its fundamental limitations. Spacecraft are marvels of engineering that can transport human beings across hundreds of thousands of miles of vacuum and return them safely to Earth despite operating in an environment that wants to kill them. But they are also fragile machines operating at the edge of what is technologically possible, with very little margin for error and very little forgiveness for component failures or design problems. They work magnificently when everything goes according to plan and all systems function as designed and no unexpected problems develop during the mission. When things don't go according to plan, survival becomes a matter of improvisation, determination, and hope combined with whatever resources are available and whatever expertise can be applied to problems that nobody anticipated during the design process. The story of Apollo 13 is ultimately a story about human resilience and ingenuity under pressure that would break most people who aren't trained for these situations. 3 men found themselves in a situation that was designed to kill them, and they refused to accept that outcome. They worked with engineers on Earth to solve problems that had never been solved before. They endured conditions that would have been unbearable under normal circumstances. They maintained their focus, and their determination when giving up would have been completely understandable, and probably more comfortable than continuing to fight against problems that seemed impossible to solve. They demonstrated that people can survive, and even thrive in situations that seem designed to defeat them when they have good training, good support, and the determination to continue working when continuing seems impossible. The mission also demonstrates the importance of teamwork and communication in crisis situations where individual effort is not sufficient to solve the problems that need to be solved. The astronauts could not have survived without the support of Mission Control. Mission Control could not have developed solutions without detailed information from the astronauts. The success of the mission depended on hundreds of people working together with precision and dedication toward a common goal that everyone understood and everyone was committed to achieving. No single person saved Apollo 13. No individual hero solved all the problems, or made all the critical decisions, or performed all the necessary tasks. The entire NASA team saved Apollo 13 through collaboration and communication and the willingness to work together despite stress and pressure and uncertainty about whether their efforts would be successful. Years later, the mission continues to inspire people who face their own seemingly impossible challenges, whether they involve business problems or personal crises or technical difficulties that seem impossible to solve using available resources. The phrase, "failure is not an option," becomes associated with the Apollo 13 mission, even though it was never actually said during the crisis, but the sentiment captures the attitude that made survival possible. When the normal solutions don't work, you develop new solutions. When the standard procedures don't apply, you create new procedures. When the situation seems hopeless, you refuse to accept hopelessness as an outcome. When the resources seem inadequate, you find ways to make them adequate through creativity and determination and the willingness to try things that have never been tried before. The technological legacy of Apollo 13 includes improvements in spacecraft design, emergency procedures, and mission planning that benefit every subsequent space mission. The human legacy includes a demonstration of what people can accomplish when they refuse to give up in the face of apparently insurmountable challenges. The cultural legacy includes a story that reminds us that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that look like failures to people who don't understand what really happened. But if you had been aboard Apollo 13 during those 4 days in April 1970, you would have learned something that no amount of preparation or training can really teach until you experience it yourself. You would have learned what it feels like to be entirely dependent on technology for survival and to have that technology fail when you need it most. You would have learned what it means to be further from safety than any human being has ever been. You would have learned that survival sometimes requires enduring conditions that are barely within the limits of human endurance, while maintaining the focus and determination necessary to solve problems that could kill you if you get them wrong. You would have spent 4 days cold, hungry, thirsty, and exhausted while trying to perform complex calculations and follow intricate procedures with precision that allows no room for error. You would have lived with the knowledge that every breath you took brought you closer to running out of air to breathe. You would have experienced what it's like to be in a situation where every decision matters, and most decisions could be your last decision if you make them incorrectly. You would have learned what it means to be in a place where help is not coming and rescue is not possible, and survival depends entirely on your ability to work with the resources you have available. Most people never face situations that require this level of sustained performance under extreme stress. Most people never have to solve problems where the wrong answer means death and the right answer means surviving until the next problem needs to be solved. Most people never experience what it's like to be in a place where the margin for error is measured in minutes or degrees or calculations that have to be perfect, because perfection is the only standard that allows survival. The astronauts of Apollo 13 faced all of these challenges and more. They survived not because they were superhuman, but because they were human beings who refused to accept death as an inevitable outcome of their situation. They used their training, their intelligence, their creativity, and their determination to solve problems that seemed unsolvable. They endured conditions that seemed unendurable. They maintained hope when hope seemed unreasonable, and continued working when working seemed impossible. And in doing so, they demonstrated something important about human nature and that applies to situations far beyond space exploration. They showed that people can survive and even thrive in situations that seem designed to defeat them. They proved that teamwork and communication and creative problem-solving can overcome challenges that individual effort cannot address. They illustrated that technology is only as good as the people who use it, and that human ingenuity can often compensate for technological failure. The story of Apollo 13 is not really a story about space exploration or rocket science or even survival against impossible odds. It's a story about people doing their jobs under the worst possible circumstances and doing those jobs well enough to live through an experience that should have killed them. It's a story about ordinary people accomplishing extraordinary things, not because they were heroes, but because they were professionals who took their responsibilities seriously and refused to quit when quitting would have been easy and understandable. As you settle into your comfortable bed tonight with its climate control and reliable electricity and breathable atmosphere that doesn't require constant monitoring by teams of engineers, remember that 55 years ago, 3 men spent 4 nights in a metal can floating through the vacuum of space, sharing body heat to stay warm and rationing water to stay alive and solving engineering problems to stay breathing. They made it home because they were smart and skilled and determined, and because hundreds of other smart and skilled and determined people worked around the clock to help them survive. They also made it home because they were lucky in ways that can't be planned for or trained for or guaranteed by any amount of preparation or expertise. And that might be the most important lesson of all. No matter how well prepared you are, no matter how skilled or dedicated or determined you might be, sometimes survival comes down to luck. Sometimes the difference between life and death is whether the explosion happens early enough in the mission that you have time to solve the problems it creates. Sometimes the difference between making it home and drifting off into space forever is whether the people on the ground can figure out how to put a square peg in a round hole using duct tape and plastic bags. Sometimes the difference between success and failure is whether enough small things go right to compensate for the big things that go wrong. The men of Apollo 13 had their share of bad luck when an oxygen tank exploded 200,000 miles from Earth. But they also had their share of good luck, in the form of a lunar module that could serve as a lifeboat, engineers who could solve impossible problems, and a space program that had prepared for emergencies, even though nobody had imagined this particular emergency. They survived because everything that needed to work worked well enough, and everything that needed to hold together held together long enough. They made it home because when faced with problems that seemed impossible to solve, they refused to accept that the problems were actually impossible, and continued working until they found solutions that nobody had thought of before. So the next time you face a challenge that seems impossible, remember Apollo 13. Remember that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to give up. Remember that creative solutions often come from combining resources in ways they were never intended to be combined. Remember that teamwork and communication can make the difference between success and failure. And remember that even when everything goes wrong, it's still possible for everything to turn out all right. Just don't expect it to be comfortable.